Hello, welcome to AQS Inmate Call, and I am your host, Joel Wilborn. Now, as a prison advocate, I hear a lot of complaints about the Department of Corrections, and that's exactly what I want to hear, and I want to broadcast it so that you folks can hear from the people who are in the prison or people who are no longer incarcerated can tell their side of the story. And you don't often hear about the things that goes on inside the prison unless there's something extremely drastic, like maybe a riot or a death occurs in there. And every day something happens. And there's various reasons why the information doesn't get out. And we, as the taxpayers, should be aware of where our taxpaying money is going. So when we tune in to podcasts or watch documentaries on television or even read articles, books, it gives us an idea of what's going on. And if it affects us in such a way that we want to get involved, that's even better because you never know when you might have somebody close to you get locked up. And with the way things are going in the United States, it's very easy that somebody who gets up in the morning and heads out with the intention of maybe protesting or just doing some shopping gets caught up in something and winds up getting arrested, maybe even convicted and going to prison. Jails, I think, are worse than the prison. I know in Spokane County, I did a podcast on that where the juvenile detention center had terrible sexual abuse and mental abuse in there. And just going to court doesn't really fix it because when I was working with Paula Gardner, she developed cancer. And it could have been prevented had the Department of Corrections done its job. And as I was researching the case for her, I discovered even more things that were going on. So doing my story on the YouTube channel gives me a chance to get it out there. I don't expect too much to be done with these things because the Department of Corrections, believe it or not, is a really big organization, especially in Washington. And people tend to not care too much about folks that are registered sex offenders or convicted hardcore criminals or even drug addicts or repeat offenders. These folks are often shoved under the rug. And in a political system, if it benefits somebody to get elected, they'll bring out some of the stuff that's going on. But if it's not something the public's really concerned about, which is often the case, not a lot of politicians, when they run, talk about helping to improve the Department of Corrections. So it's up to us who are directly involved to get the word out and maybe make it a point to put it on the campaign message. And whenever I see candidates running, it doesn't matter this person is, what the political affiliation is. If this person is looking to improve the penal system, I'm willing to listen. And there are some celebrities out there who are speaking up, and I stand behind that. But the biggest hurdle that we run into is just getting the change. And if you're anything like me, if you contact people and then get ignored, or it's just a half job that's done to correct the issue, you're going to want to continue just to bang the drum a little bit louder. And that's pretty much what a lot of us have to do. Now, I work with people who are locked up, and it's harder for me because these folks are pretty much suppressed. When they know that I'm reaching out to these folks to get information, the DOC likes to tighten the grip. So I do get that information from those folks, but it's not as easy as it used to be. And that's because the DOC is beginning to, I guess, fear that information getting out. But when the people do get out, I can get a lot of information. Now, I had worked with a person over the years who accused me of, I guess, threatening or putting some of the women in uncomfortable positions or something. But she said that there were numerous women that didn't want to speak to me in the women's prison. Now, that's a vague statement, and numerous is a lot of people. Now, that could pretty much be the entire prison population. And at that time, there were 2 female prisons. So I would contact her and ask her to give me the names of these people. Because if I'm not supposed to contact them, it's kind of difficult to do when you don't know who they are. And I think this statement was more or less to just say, stop talking to the people in the women's prison, which was kind of odd because I was talking to all the prisons all across the United States, even some overseas. But she was particularly interested in the women's prison. And she was useless, just ignored me. But her name is Charlotte Headley, and she eventually became the superintendent at what's now the only female prison in the state of Washington. And I'm not a big fan of Headley because of the way she dealt with my inquiries for Paula Gardner. So I would file my complaints and do my podcast on her, and I would interview former inmates to get some ideas of her. And some had good things to say about her, but for the most part, they shared the same opinion as I did, really close to that. Now, one day, the superintendent was gone from the position. And I knew there were some investigations and I knew there were some issues that were going on. I just didn't have any detail. It was difficult to get. And I can't blame the people who are incarcerated for being tight-lipped. They don't want to say anything. But when one of them recently got out, she spilled the beans. Apparently, the superintendent had a personal connection to one of the inmates. And this inmate, for whatever reason, goes into the hole, or what's now called solitary. And there was no restrictions put on how she was treated. So she could really get beat up by the prison guards. And some of the prison guards show respect for people, but a lot of them treat the people who are in prison as substandard humans. They don't have a right to the same treatment that the rest of us get out here. And that's scary. Now, we're going to take a closer look inside the Washington State Department of Corrections, which is an institution responsible for safety, rehabilitation, and public trust. But behind the walls, stories of misconduct, retaliation, and abuse of power have raised urgent questions. How does a system this large hold itself accountable? And what happens when it doesn't? This episode explores the patterns of abuse that have surfaced over the years and the growing efforts to oversee the DOC and protect the people inside its custody. The Washington Department of Corrections, or DOC, oversees more than a dozen prisons and thousands of staff. With that scale comes enormous authority over movement, communication, discipline, and even access to basic needs. But authority without transparency can become something else entirely. Across Washington's facilities, incarcerated people and staff have reported issues ranging from misuse of state resources to breaches of privacy and retaliation. These aren't isolated incidents, they reflect a pattern of power being exercised without adequate checks. Recent enforcement actions by the state's Executive Ethics Board show how misconduct can manifest even in everyday operation. Cases include DOC employees using state computers for personal benefit, improperly accessing confidential information, or misusing state vehicles. Penalties have ranged from $500 to $4,000 depending on the severity of the violation. While these examples may seem administrative, they reveal a deeper truth. When rules are bent behind the scenes, the people most vulnerable, incarcerated individuals, often feel the consequences first. Abuse of power inside correctional systems can take many forms: retaliation against incarcerated people who file grievances, selective enforcement of rules, improper use of confidential information, lack of accountability when staff violate policy, and barriers to reporting misconduct. In Washington, advocates and families have long argued that the DOC's internal grievance system is slow, inconsistent, and often controlled by the very staff being accused. That creates a chilling effect. People fear speaking up because the process itself feels unsafe. And when the only witnesses are behind bars, the truth can be hard to surface. But Washington is not without tools for accountability. In fact, the state has taken several steps to bring transparency to the DOC, though many argue more is needed. The Office of the Corrections Ombuds, OCO, was created to prevent independent oversight, to investigate complaints, conducts monitoring visits, and publishes reports on systematic issues. It operates independently within the governor's office, giving it the authority to review DOC practices without internal interference. Now, the OCO, they investigate individual complaints, conducts unannounced monitoring visits, mediates disputes between incarcerated people and DOC, publishes public reports on systematic failures, provides confidential communication channels for families of incarcerated individuals. This office has become one of the most important watchdogs in the state's correctional landscape. And outside government organizations like Washington Corrections Watch conduct public records research to expose behind the walls practices. Their work helps journalists, families, and advocates understand what's happening inside the facilities that are otherwise closed to the public. As mentioned earlier, the board investigates misconduct by state employees, including DOC staff, and issues penalties when violations occur. These cases, while often administrative, create a public record of accountability and help deter future misconduct. Oversight exists, but oversight is not the same as transformation. Advocates argue that the DOC still holds too much control over internal investigations. Many complaints never reach outside reviewers. And while the OCO has authority, it does not have unlimited access or enforcement power. Some of the biggest gaps include limited power to compel DOC to act, slow implementation of recommendations, underreporting due to fear of retaliation, lack of transparency around staff discipline, insufficient independent monitoring of use of force incidents. In other words, the watchdogs can bark, but they can't always bite. Oversight isn't about punishing staff, it's about building a system that works. A system where people in custody are treated with dignity, staff are supported and held to clear standards, families have somewhere to turn, the public can trust the taxpayer funded institutions operate ethically. When oversight is strong, abuse of power becomes harder to hide. And when abuse becomes harder to hide, it becomes harder to commit. The Washington Department of Corrections is a powerful institution, and with power comes responsibility. Oversight isn't optional, it's essential. As Washington continues to refine its accountability system, one truth remains: transparency protects everyone. Now, if you or someone you know has concerns about conditions inside a Washington DOC facility, the Office of the Corrections Ombuds accepts confidential complaints and publishes resources for families. Now, you can go to the DOC website, and there's a contact list where it allows you to file an online uh, inquiry or complaint, or even if you have a nice little compliment form. And sometimes they'll refer you to the public records unit, and I often get referred there, and I often get really good information from them. And so I'm going to start relying more on the public records unit and this communication portal that they created. They'll usually do a lot of just kind of cover up answers, very standard. But using that along with the ombuds and along with the public records unit, you can do quite a bit. And whenever I apply for visitation, the same person who accuses me of committing a crime or a violation that qualifies as a reason not to visit, that same person is the one who reviews it and, of course, denies it again. So a lot of the stuff that I've mentioned here, I've personally experienced. And it's easier for me to take control of a situation when I'm the victim. But it's a little more difficult and it takes a little more time to deal with those who are locked up. And when you hear the podcast on that Shaylin Altus gave me, she herself is explaining what goes on inside that prison and what happened to her to get her there. And often the interviews I do on the YouTube channel, people are telling you what happened to them before prison, what's happening to them during prison, and what you can tell friends and family to help them stay out of prison. So, if anything, we can rely on each other. We can't always rely on the state resources and the state to do its job without, of course, hounding them. But when we band together, when we have these groups, we can share information and we can help make it a little bit easier. When I find a solution and the steps to get to that solution, I share that immediately with my audience and with the people inside the support groups. And I think slowly we'll get somewhere. We'll help these people out. Well, thank you for listening. Stay informed, stay engaged, and join us next time as we continue to shine where it is needed most.